All right. So why don't we just get started today? So today is session 4. I know this document says session 3, but that's because we are going to continue where we left off from last class, um, and kind of go into more depth with the writing and language test in particular today. But we will also address any questions from last week or any of the homework. So a lot of what we're going to be doing today is focusing on some terminology review, as well as focusing on um, getting some experience with the actual practice test in terms of identifying types of questions that we were learning about last week and about the types of questions that you will typically encounter on the writing and language test. Okay. If anyone has any questions at any time, please feel free to make a note of it in the chat for me or raise your hand. And I can, in some like in some way through the chat, will address any questions. Otherwise, you can always email me after class. Okay. So without further ado, let's get started. So we have today, what was due was practice test 10. And you also needed to complete, um, it should have been practice test 10 for the reading and the evidence-based reading and the writing and language test, as well as any vocabulary if you're working on that with us, or if you were taking the SAT essay component for June, for the last kind of installment of the essay, then you definitely needed to be working on essay 10 for this week. Okay, so let's kind of get started. So what I'd like to start with is to kind of look at, just kind of recap what we did last week, first of all, which for those of you who were here, we kind of went through general reading strategies for the reading passages. And I went over some additional examples of strategies that you can employ that students have used on the SAT with success before. However, I also gave you my specific strategy for students that I think all students should follow because it's going to help you get ahead with the reading test. So what you need to do if you haven't looked at that information, you need to go through it because it's important to the rest of your study in this class, okay? So every student should be familiar with the types of passages that we're going to be seeing. So the subject matter, the general subject matter that you will see. So things like classic and contemporary literature. You're also going to be seeing things that are more historical, like history or humanities based, or dealing with social science topics or science passages. So if you are unfamiliar with all of that, please review it. It's all in the document I shared last week, so you should have access to that. All right, so going forward, all students should have also this week identified the order in which you will do the passages, okay? So this is individualized to you, okay? So everyone should know by now, if they've done their homework, and listened in class last week, that you need to identify which order you're going to be approaching the passages for reading. Okay, so you need to identify if you're doing the literature passage first, if that's one of your strengths, or if that you're most comfortable with that and feel confident that you've been getting those answers correct, with higher probability than any of the other sections, then start with that one. Same thing for any of the other ones. Also, if you found in your kind of an own personal analysis of the test, which was part of your homework for this week, to kind of assess your own comfort with the subject material, but also to focus on determining your particular reading strategy. Okay, so once you've already finished figuring out which order of passages you're going to be doing, if you're starting with literature and ending with science, or if you're going in a completely different order, whatever order you decide is perfectly fine. And it will be different than anyone else in this class, because in most cases, because it's going to be customized to what you need as a test taker. okay? Um, but once you've done that, you should have this week assessed your timing on each of these sections. So you should have an idea if you're consistently completing each section within that time frame. So that means that 12-minute time allotment that we've assigned you for the reading test with this strategy, that you are able to complete each passage or paired passage within that 12-minute time limit for each passage. Okay, with the exception of the paired passage where you have 12 minutes to cover both passages in the paired section. Okay, all right. So that's one thing that you needed to have done for today. And I would have expected you to do that in the analysis that I asked you to do of your previous practice tests. And also to familiarize yourself with the concepts that we talked about, like process of elimination, using only a single slash when marking off, and only marking off the letter when you're doing your answer choices. I'm not going to go through all of this, but these are just things from last week that you should have done this week, and start consistently doing with any practice test. Okay, so I expect you to start doing this every week. Once you've actually just determined, I'll clarify, once you actually determine your preferred order for the passages, you don't have to continue to like reassess unless you're finding that you're running out of time or running into an issue. Okay, and then you can reevaluate and switch up your order to find a better strategy that would work for you. But that's not usually what needs to happen, but that in some cases, some students might start with one passage and then have to switch their order because their strategy is no longer working as well. That doesn't typically happen. Typically, once you get started on the strategy, you're good to go. Okay, so the other things that you needed to have done this week: memorize the instructions to the evidence-based reading test. So I expect everyone in this class right now to have memorized those instructions. If you haven't, continue working on it until you do have it memorized, because it's going to help you in the long run. Okay. You also, I expect everyone to anytime you are approached with passage, or you're given a passage to work on for homework, that you've read the introductory information of the passage. It's in your best interest to do that because it's going to help you find key clues in the text and give you context to the passage that you're going to be reading. You also should be reading the passages and annotating as you read. And I went through last week how to annotate. So you need to make sure that you are not spending more than 5 minutes reading and annotating any passage, okay? So because timing is key on this exam. Annotations include things like circling proper nouns and numbers in the text, underlining keywords, phrases, ideas, information, underlining topic and concluding sentences in a passage, writing a keyword or phrase next to each paragraph. I expect all of these techniques to be in your homework every week, okay, going forward, okay? Unless you found another strategy that works better for you, then by all means use that strategy. But I tell this to students all the time: if you do not underline or circle or annotate in any way, you're going to make careless errors on this test. Okay, so that's true for most standardized testing, but specifically in this reading section, you are going to, and actually it's true for any of the sections on this exam, you need to be looking at what the question says, but also what the information is in the passage so that you can more quickly find it in the passage. Okay, all right. So I'm not going to belabor the reading section, but just remember that you should also be working on understanding the coding system that I gave you for identifying different question types. Okay, so you can just focus on memorizing the general, like the main ones that I've given you in bold, that we went over last week. But you do need to start coding them, because we're going to be referring to those codes in our lessons. Okay, so it's going to be going over identifying what each question type is and how to approach it, and when in our when exactly when we're working on a particular passage or section should we address a certain type of question in most cases. Okay, so everyone should be thinking about those types of things and practicing these techniques in your practice tests and homework. Okay, we already went through all of that, so I want to just kind of focus on get us to the writing and language test. So today, just like last week, how we've kind of focused more exclusively on reading, this week we're going to be focusing a little bit more on the writing and language test. Okay, so this is critical because much of the writing and language test has to do with your knowledge of language. I mean, it's buried in the test. You can't escape. You have to have some sort of knowledge of language. And that includes things like being able to identify things from simple grammar concepts. So how to use like the function of language in a given context, or how to create a grammatical construction. And also, it has to do with your understanding of things like figurative language, how we actually, especially in like a literary passage in particular, you're going to see things like metaphor, simile. You're going to be seeing things like imagery. You're going to be seeing things like alliteration in terms of an author's deliberate use of a literary or figurative technique in order to convey their message, okay, to be able to communicate with their audience. You will also see different styles of argument, okay, so different manners of speaking, different ways to communicate ideas, and with different purposes, and creating different effects with language. Okay, so this writing and language test is really going to be focusing on your understanding of language, but also your ability as a writer and as an editor and as a reader. Okay, because in order to be able to approach this section, you need to know how to do reading, because you need to be able to be able to analyze a text, understand who the intended audience is in a passage, as well as look at things through the writer's eyes in terms of what techniques they're employing, why they're using certain techniques or ideas in a particular way, as well as your ability to, so you're assessing basically as a reader, as the audience, right? Or as a third person kind of reader. So you're either the audience, the reader, or in terms of being able to see who the intended audience is, so you're being outside of the reader, or you are the reader themselves. Okay, so it depends on the particular text that we're dealing with, but those are kinds of things that you need to be on the lookout for or familiar with doing, which all of you should be if you've made it through K through 12th grade, like already. All right, so I mean, if you've been going through high school at this point in your academic careers, you should all be familiar with how to do this, how to act as an editor in revising language, what the writing process is. You should all be familiar with that. If you are not, for any reason, or if grammar is like your kryptonite, basically, like, email me, let me know, and I'm happy to go over things more in depth. I do plan for us today to kind of delve into some of the grammar, but grammar in and of itself is a very complex topic, and it is something that if you are struggling with it and not familiar with some of the terms that I'm going to throw at you today, you need to let me know, because I can't help you if I don't know that you're struggling with this concept, okay? Because everyone comes from a different writing background, a different experience with the English language, okay, as well as a different kind of perspective as an editor, okay? But all of you need to be able to tell me that you are that you're struggling, okay? Because I can't help you unless I know that you need help, okay? All right. So that all being said, you're basically focusing on the writing and language test as a reader, a writer, and an editor. Okay. So these are technically skills that you've been working on since you started school, and actually since you started learning language. Okay. So that means it has to do, in essence, with the communication of ideas and thoughts, okay, to other people. So what I want us to actually kind of, we're going to get like a little bit of a big picture of the writing and language test to start off with today, and then we're going to go into more of a technical review. And then we're going to look at some practical examples from your homework and any of the other passages that we have time for, okay? So you have only about 8 minutes per passage in the English, in the writing and language test, to read and answer the question. So you don't have time to dwell. You don't have time to linger on questions. You have less time for the overall writing and language test than you do for the reading test, because reading generally takes more time, and when you're dealing with comprehension, it definitely takes a lot more time, okay? Whereas with the writing and language test, the passages that you're reading were specifically designed by the test makers in order to allow you to edit the text, to be able for them to have more control over the intended meaning as a writer and as an editor. So it makes their job easier, and it makes it a little more challenging sometimes for you as the editor or writer to critique the information, because it doesn't always make sense because of the example that they give you in the text, okay, for certain things. In terms of being normally in with writing, you would be able to glean things from context more. You would be able to assess and get like a better idea of a piece as a whole, whereas you don't always get that luxury with this type of test, okay? And that's because they're focusing on a minute level for any of the grammar, and the grammar choice that they give you is not always grammatically correct or the right choice for you to be able to fully understand their meaning. But the good news is that we can decode it, and we can get you on the right track by being able to identify what the question is actually asking you to answer, and to focus on each individual question within the whole of the passage, just like you would when you're editing a text in class, or editing an essay or another work for another student. Okay, so 8 minutes, you got to aim for that in your approach to this section. Okay, so 8 minutes per passage. Okay, and you need to ideally read each passage at least once, ideally twice, but again, just like with the reading section, it depends on how quickly you can read. And also it depends on whether or not you're able to understand the text. If you're not able to understand the text and what it's talking about, try to move on to the questions, just like you would with the reading test, because you need to be able to look in isolation as well as in the broader narrative of the actual piece of writing as a whole. And the questions are going to help focus that and direct you to where specifically in the text you need to focus your energies on, rather than trying to drag you into like analyzing the entire thing all at once. Okay, so you can kind of chunk it. You can break it down and make it a little bit more manageable. All right, so when you read, you are reading for understanding. You're focusing on underlining keywords and concepts still, and you're coding the passage. So by coding, I mean you're identifying, you are putting in key terms to like a keyword, just like you would with the reading passages, so that you can identify quickly what that particular paragraph is about, as well as what the central concept for the whole piece is. And that's to help you be able to better tackle the questions, okay? You can't skip on doing all of that. So you can't skip on doing the underlining and circling. And I'm going to show you why later today, because of how easy it is to make mistakes if you do not know, if you don't do the underlining, okay? Like, annotation is key to this test, okay? You can't skip it. All right, so on this section, you will also see box numbers, okay, which is different than the reading test. So the box numbers, which you've seen in our examples for the practice tests, that they're kind of to draw your attention to specific questions or particular lines of text that you need to focus on for particular questions, okay? It's helpful to circle them. They are boxed, but it will help you more quickly jump to the right section, okay? All right. Types of writing, concepts and question types for writing and language. So like I said, the writing and language test really focuses on your ability as a reader, as a writer, and as an editor. So it focuses on your ability to communicate and understand ideas, and to understand how language works and why we have to put it in certain constructs in order to be able to convey our thoughts and ideas, okay? So here you have, so there's gonna be a lot of questions about grammar and mechanics of language. That's just goes with kind of out saying with when you're dealing with writing and language, okay? Standard English conventions. So you are specifically dealing with something called prescriptive grammar in linguistics, which I'm not going to get into the differences, but that has to do basically with standard English conventions. So this is the standard form of the language that we're dealing with so that everyone can communicate with each other. So every language has a standard form. And if you study any foreign languages, you're studying typically the standard form of that language. And that's so that you can communicate more effectively with and more precisely with more people. Okay, so standard English conventions, just like you use in school, just like you use in any formal writing. So if you are unfamiliar with what those are, that has a lot to do with how language works, as well as stylistic choices and different things like that that we integrate when we write and when we're speaking, okay? So that we can more effectively communicate our ideas to other people, okay? Expression of ideas, huge part of writing because writing is thinking, okay? So that's also why writing can be so hard as a discipline for students because, and for professionals too sometimes, because you are expressing ideas. You're conveying information to other people. You're communicating thoughts. So because writing is thinking, okay? Language is our way of being able to communicate our thoughts and ideas to other people, okay? Language enables us to be able to decode and decipher what other people are saying and why, okay? So like we practice those skills all the time when we're doing writing and when we're doing reading and when we're doing editing, okay? So these are all skills that you have, but the SAT is going to trick you by being very technical, okay? So it's going to ask you for what's in a positive phrase, for instance, like different things that we use, like you would know what, you would be able to recognize what that is and how to use it, but you might not recognize what the technical term for it is in grammar, unless you had a really good English teacher who enforced grammar, okay? Or you've been studying other languages and had to learn the grammar in order to understand another language, okay? Don't worry so much about being like, I don't know what synecdoche is, or which is more of a literary technique or things like that. Those are very rare that they will give you very technique, like literary technique oriented questions for this section. Your focus is more on grammatical understanding and being able to deal with things like precision in language and writing, and to deal with be able to identify elements of writing. Okay, so those are going to be basic things that you know how to you know how to do, or you should know how to do by this point. Okay, and if you don't, let me know. Okay, so expression of ideas is going to involve concepts like syntax, and if you don't know what syntax is, it's the technical term for sentence structure. Okay, and word order and organization of a language. Okay, so syntax is the essence of how we create grammatical constructions. You also have like organization in general in terms of how you are ordering your thoughts, how you are connecting them together. Okay, logic and reasoning is very straightforward. It should be like dealing with evidence, like what is your support that you're providing. It also has to do with the flow of your essay. Do things seamlessly flow from one idea to the next, or are there gaps where we don't understand how you jumped from one idea to another, and so we're not sure what you're saying as an author? Okay, so those are types of things that we're going to be looking for and that the test is going to be asking you about. Okay, you also, again, like I said, evidence and supporting details is a huge part. It's very much related to logic and reasoning, but it also has to do with our ability to explain our ideas coherently to other people. Okay, and provide concrete evidence to support our ideas. Okay, strength of argument is another aspect of this type of section. Okay, so this concept of expression of ideas deals with whether or not you have a strong argument. So is the writing choices you're making, or the choices you're making as an author or writer, applicable? Like, I mean, are they helping you with convey your ideas, or are they hindering what you're doing because of how you're saying things? Okay, so that has to do with style as well with writing, as well as the techniques that you're using. So if you're using things like ethos, pathos, or logos, so logos being basically logic and reasoning and evidence, whereas pathos is more of like you're dealing with emotional appeals, essentially. So appealing to people's, like making people sympathetic with you, like that type of thing, like, or making them based on the tone you're using, things like that. Ethos has more to do with your credibility as a writer, your credibility as an author. Are you making a credible argument? Is what you're saying, does it make sense? Are there like any moral issues with what you're saying? Are there, it has more to do with kind of people's perception of, or like the actual understanding of what's going on with your writing. Okay. Rhetorical techniques and strategies. So this has, I mean, logos, ethos, and pathos are all actually rhetorical techniques. They're actually strategies, rhetorical strategies in writing. Okay. And essentially what that entails is the techniques, like why you're doing the function, the usage of the rationale behind your choices as an author. So that could even range to something as simplistic as diction. So diction is essentially your word choice, but it is a little bit more than that. We'll go through a lot of these technical terms, but today's focus is really going to be more on our understanding of grammar, because if we don't have a foundation in grammar, we can't focus on these larger ideas about writing and editing. Okay, because if you don't understand language and how it works and why it works, or how and why we use things in a certain way, then we need to go over that in more depth in order for you to be able to understand our techniques as a writer, as a reader, as an editor, okay, for this test, okay? So editing skills, again, this is your ability to revise through the writing, the different steps of the writing process to understand and interpret your, analyze and interpret your language or the language of another. Especially in this case, it's focusing more on a formal writing context, okay? So exactly what you've been doing all the time with school, okay? You're gonna be focusing on things like punctuation. So that kind of falls under mechanics of language and grammar, okay? Because it's tied into that. But I've made mention of it here because, as a separate kind of entity, because it is, students often think of it as a separate entity. But it technically falls under grammar and mechanics of language. So like writing conventions. But punctuation has to do with our ability to understand and communicate ideas to other people, because we use punctuation to insert pauses or to put to indicate the end of a thought, okay? And we're going to go over a little bit today on why and how we do that once we can get to sentences, okay? So redundancy is another concept. So if things are redundant, I mean, it's overly, like, there's no point in, you want to eliminate redundancy. So redundancy has more to do with like things like repetition, which is another category here too. But it has to do, if you're being redundant, that means that you've already said that. You're being overly repetitive for no reason, okay? And we want to avoid unnecessary repetition. Sometimes an author will make stylistic choices to repeat an idea or concept or a phrase or a word deliberately with a specific intent in mind. In most cases, what the SAT is going to be focusing on is your ability to recognize whether something is necessary or not if it's being repeated. Okay, so that's one of the key skills. And generally, we don't want anything to do with repetition. We want a repetition out. Okay, so that's kind of a good rule of thumb, is to say if something is being, if the author is being redundant or if they're being overly repetitive, like eliminate it. That's kind of your clue. Chances are we don't need it because they've said it elsewhere, and repeating our thoughts, unless it's as a deliberate stylistic choice by the author for a particular reason, we want to avoid being repetitive and redundant, okay? Data interpretation and analysis. So this section is also going to include data interpretation and analysis. So that includes your ability to understand and interpret data, and to analyze and assess an author's use of data. Okay, so just like we have like the DR question, like the data response questions or the data reasoning questions on the reading section, you're still going to be dealing with interpreting and understanding data. You are, because I mean, that is part of writing and part of understanding ideas and conveying thoughts. So that's an integral part to writing and language on this test, okay? Any kind of questions so far from anyone? Okay, for those of you who came in late, all of this will be, we just initially kind of reviewed what we did before, what we did last week, of what everyone should be working on consistently with their practice tests going forward. And we're right now kind of diving into writing and language so that we can get to a kind of nitty gritty grammar review, which I know a few students were looking to have. And if you have any questions about what we've covered earlier that you missed, please email me, okay? And homework will be sent out again for everyone after class, okay? All right, so grammar question types. There's a lot of grammar on this test. So there are things like word choice, which is basically diction. It's diction, okay? So there are, it has to do with how we use language, what a word means, how we're using it, if it has any implied meanings, how it's evolved over time. So diction is more complex than just simply word choice, okay? Homophones are words that sound similar. So that's where the phones portion of it comes in. So phones being sound, so dealing with phonetics and dealing with our understanding of how language sounds in this case. And the prefix there is also meaning, dealing with similar meaning, essentially, or I mean similar sounds. It basically is what it's saying. Okay, we're dealing with things like related words. We're dealing with concision of language, so being concise, so being able to succinctly say what it is that we're trying to say. Okay, and to be precise with our language. So using an appropriate word or using the proper construction to convey a thought, okay? We also have things like idiomatic expressions. So these are kind of features of our language or phrases that kind of have come down over time in our language that native speakers typically learn just naturally through language or even through school, where you are dealing with kind of specific ideas that are kind of conveyed through language in a way. That's a simple explanation for it right now. We'll get into more technical terms later. Conventional expressions, so dealing with like writing conventions, editing conventions, all of that is in here. Linguistic, language conventions, all in there, okay? You're dealing with things like verb tense. So tense is probably something that all of you should be familiar with. If you're not, we'll go over it. We're going to go over it anyway, okay? Subject verb agreement, huge on the SAT, okay? So that is something that they test very frequently. Non-restrictive versus non-essential clauses, restrictive versus essential clauses, appositive phrases, comma usage, comma splice, semicolon usage, colon, independent clauses, dependent clauses, or subordinate clauses, as they're also called. Simple sentences, compound sentences, complex sentences, compound complex sentences. All of those are all different types of sentences that we're going to be talking about today. Okay, we have separating, if we can get there, separating independent clauses. So using punctuation or using how to kind of transition between one idea and another. That also kind of falls under that. Apostrophe usage. So again, that's another example of punctuation, but it is a specific type that they test frequently. Modifiers. So this is sort of a broad category. It can deal with any type of word that is a modifier that falls into the modifier category. So that could be an adjective or an adverb or other words, okay? We're going to get into what those are in just a second. Dangling and misplaced modifiers. So if your teachers haven't gone over what those are, we will cover it eventually, hopefully today, but maybe in another session. So possessive plurals, pronoun agreement, antecedents, run-on sentences, fragments, prepositional phrases, understanding subject and predicate. So essentially understanding sentences, dashes, so there are examples, M dash, N dash, hyphen. Those are just some common ones that we use frequently and that they test you on. Conjunctions and conjunctive adverbs, language formality, commonly confused words and usage, verbal phrases, miscellaneous grammar concepts. So even though I've given you a pretty extensive list of what they commonly focus on in terms of grammar, there are still going to be grammar concepts that they may throw at you that are not on this list, okay? Because grammar is a very broad topic, okay? So it's very, and there are so many things that you have to learn in terms of understanding language and in terms of being a writer and an editor and a reader, okay? That we can't possibly cover all of them, but they're all skills, I promise you, that you should be familiar with. So so long as you're able to figure out what sounds right to you as a native speaker of English. If you are a native speaker of English, um, you will be able to find the right answer choice. And if you can't, then, or if you are not a native speaker of English, um, and grammar is a tricky point for you, then email me and we can talk about specific strategies for you, in terms of understanding these concepts and getting ahead with the SAT. Okay. I did give you last week a bunch of different exercises or a bunch of different resources that you can use to kind of go through a lot of these grammar concepts. All right. So that's in essence what the writing and language test is about. A lot of it has to do with your ability to analyze a passage, figure out how things kind of work, which all of you should be able to do if you've been doing writing since kindergarten. Okay. All right. So that being said, what we're going to do now, I wanted to take a quick look at, actually there's another thing I wanted us to look here. Okay. So I'm sure all of you at one point or another have heard your teachers, especially your English teachers, talk about the 8 parts of speech. Okay. Basically what these are categories for words in a language. Okay. For different types of words in a language, different functions of words in a language. Okay. These are the main categories. There are numerous subtypes. Okay. But in essence, what you really need to know are just what these broad categories are. Okay. Um, if you understand the function of a word in a sentence and how it's being used, you don't even need to know the technical term for what it is. Okay. So long as you can figure out and identify based on context what that word is doing in the sentence, what its purpose in the sentence is grammatically, and also on like a writing and editing level, or in addressing the reader kind of level, you can figure out without having to know all the technical terms for grammar. Okay. Um, I do recommend for everyone to familiarize yourself with grammar because it's going to make the English and the writing test easier here. Okay. So we're going to just quickly run through what these are. In essence, okay, because there are far more technical terms and definitions, and it varies depending on the specific type of each of these that you're dealing with. Okay, how the rules specifically work for that type of word. But in essence, these are what all of you should be familiar with. Okay, so nouns. Nouns are are naming pieces, basically. Like the nouns are. A noun is basically a person, place, thing, or idea or concept. Okay, so you have it. So that's a lot. A person, place, thing, idea, or concept. Like all of that. So idea and concept I kind of use interchangeably sometimes, but they are technically kind of two different things. You should understand what a noun is at this point in your schooling. You should be able to identify nouns, and you should know as well that there are technically 2 different types. Okay, so there are things called proper nouns, which are naming or like are nouns that are discussing, like addressing a very specific person, place, thing, idea, or concept. And there are things called common nouns or general nouns. The technical name for it varies, but basically they're general. They're exactly that. They're common. They are not referring to a specific person, place, thing, or idea. Okay. One other kind of key clue for proper nouns versus common nouns are that proper nouns are always capitalized. So the first the first letter of any proper noun is always capitalized. Okay, so that could be like Miss Hennessy, my name. Okay, so it's a proper noun because it's referring to a specific person. Okay, it could also be like the name of your school. That's an example of a specific school rather than just saying school, right? So you kind of get the general idea. Pronouns are a special type of word that can take the place of a noun in a sentence. Okay, so there are all different types of pronouns, but in essence, any pronoun is always going to take the place of a noun in a sentence. What type of pronoun is used varies depending on the location of the noun it's replacing, okay, and its function in the sentence, okay? These are words like, for instance, you have subject pronouns. So those are subject pronouns, or subjective pronouns are things that can take, like the three main types that you're going to see or that you would be most familiar with offhand would be things like subjective pronouns, objective pronouns or object pronouns, and possessive pronouns, which are also technically possessive adjectives because they're, I'll get into that in a minute. But basically, pronouns are words that can take the place of a noun in a sentence. Okay, so it can take the place of a proper noun and it can take the place of a common noun. Okay, so it doesn't matter what type of noun you're dealing with, there's a word that can take the place of it. Okay, and part of the reason for that is so that we can vary our sentence structure. I mean, if we're constantly using proper nouns all the time, we're going to be overly repetitive, and we're going to get bored when we're reading or trying to speak and convey information to someone. And if we do that as a speaker, like, someone's not going to pay attention to us. We're not going to be able to communicate our ideas. So that's kind of why pronouns exist, so that we can vary our sentence structure, keep our audience engaged in what we're trying to communicate to them, as well as to provide kind of flexibility in terms of writing and conveying information. Okay, so pronouns, in essence, the three main types that you're probably most familiar with are subjective pronouns, which are pronouns that can take the place of a noun, and a noun acting as the subject of a sentence. Whereas an object pronoun or objective pronoun is one that is going to take the place of a noun acting as an object in a sentence. Okay, so if you're not sure what I mean by subject and object, I'm going to get to it. Okay. You also have things like possessive pronouns. So these are things like his, hers, yours, mine. You have all of these different types of words that in essence, they show ownership or show a relationship of between different nouns, like to say, like, my phone, right? For instance, so this is my phone, it belongs to me, but it is also saying something like this phone has a relationship to me. It's something that it belongs to me. Like it's not yours. It belongs to me. So I mean, there are kind of basic things like that in language that are conveying those types of ideas. So it's conveying an idea, right? An idea that an object belongs to someone else, right? But it's also doing kind of more than that. It's more complex than that. That's just a very simplistic breakdown of what a possessive pronoun really kind of is doing. So it's also called possessive adjectives because they're technically, the way that they're being used in the sentence is as an adjective. It's a word that's going to be modifying or describing a noun, another noun. Okay, so it's going to be showing connection or relationship to another noun in the sentence. Okay, between different nouns. Okay, all right. Verbs. In essence, verbs are action words. They're more the technical definition for them is much more complex than that, but it is in essence an action, whether or not that's a physical action, a mental action, or like an emotion that you're experiencing, or a state of being. Like all of those, or I mean, like even expressing a state of existence or a state of being. Those types of things are conveyed by verbs. So verbs are, in essence, are action words. Okay, so they're going to tell us what's happening in a sentence, whereas the noun is typically who is doing the action or what is happening to, like, what is having the action done to it. Okay, so nouns and verbs are kind of critical for us because when we're making sentences, we need to have at least two ingredients in order to be able to have a complete sentence. And I'm going to get into that in just a minute, but nouns and verbs are very crucial to that. Okay. Adjectives, just like I kind of went over a minute ago. Adjectives are words that describe nouns. Okay, that's their function. They modify, so meaning that they are kind of explaining information or adding information about a noun, but they also kind of describe a noun in more depth. Like, so it could be like a color word, like green or pink, but it can also be something like tall or quiet, things like that. Okay, adverbs are words that describe three different things. So adjectives focus on nouns or pronouns. Okay, so they can describe a noun or a pronoun. That's all they describe. That's all they modify. Whereas adverbs are words that can describe a verb. It can also describe an adjective, and it can describe another adverb. Okay, so quickly as an example, of an adverb that is able to fulfill those three different functions. Okay, they don't have to fulfill the same three different functions all at the same time. That would not happen in grammar, or at least not usually. But you would have instances here where an adverb basically is a modifier of either a verb, like saying how fast you're going, or like describing another like describing an adjective or describing another adverb in a sentence. Okay, we'll get into that more in a minute. You also have a category called conjunctions. So conjunctions are, in essence, connecting words. Okay, so they're going to connect different sections of a sentence together, different ideas together, different like they can connect different types of words together, like a noun or verb. Like, so you can have a compound noun or compound, like compound subject or compound predicate in a sentence. You can also have things, they're just connecting words. Okay. Fanboys, if you're familiar with that acronym, kind of falls under conjunctions. So that's like for, nor, and, but, so, yet, I'm missing. So anyway, the fanboys are essentially conjunctions. You have different types of conjunctions, but those are the ones that typically act as literally connecting on a word level, phrase level, and sentence level in a sentence. You have things like prepositions. Prepositions are are also little connecting words. They connect and just kind of provide relationships between words in a sentence, specifically between nouns. So they connect a noun or a pronoun to another part of the sentence. Okay, so that could be something as simple as saying the tree is above me, right? So you have the tree. So if actually, I'll type that here. So the tree is our subject. So it's telling me who or what the sentence is about. Is our verb. Above is the preposition. Me is an objective pronoun. So it's telling me where it's connecting the word me to the rest of the sentence. Okay, so it's telling me in relationship to the verb in this case, but it doesn't always have to be in relationship to the verb. It can be in relation to another word in the sentence or another phrase in the sentence to connect ideas, okay? So that you can have nouns throughout a sentence. And so this is an example of an objective pronoun because the pronoun is acting as an object in the sentence. So it happens to be an object of a preposition in a prepositional phrase, and there will always be an object of a preposition, or should always be. So there should always be a noun or a pronoun that's following the preposition and that it's modifying. Okay. Okay. Anyway, that's enough for prepositions for right now. Interjections. So interjections are phrases like, oh, well, I don't know. Like the well in that example. So if you're saying like, oh, right, I understand what you're saying. Oh, it happens to be an interjection. Well, I don't know. Well is actually an interjection. It doesn't fall into any of the other categories, right? In the way that it's being used. You can say, I am well today, and then you're changing the meaning of the word. But here it's being used as an interjection to add additional information to the sentence to convey thought and idea. You can also, like, happens to be like if you say I don't know. Happens to be, which I just said, happens to be an example of an interjection. So it can buy you time to finish saying what you're thinking, or while you're thinking and conveying that you are responding to someone or something when you're speaking. But it also can convey that it just conveys additional information in terms of communication with someone. Okay, so those are, in essence, are the basic parts of speech. I want to look at sentences a little bit before we delve into a little bit more grammar review and look at some examples. Okay, so we have a sentence. A sentence, in essence, is a complete thought or idea. That's what it is. You also can break it down as a sentence being equal to a subject and a predicate. And what subject is, in essence, is a noun. There's a noun that will always be telling me who or what the sentence is about. Okay, that's in essence, in its most basic form, a subject in the sentence is always going to be a noun or a pronoun. Okay, that's telling me who or what the sentence is about. A verb is the most simplistic form, the essence of a predicate in the sentence. So the predicate is explaining what's happening in the sentence, what's the action in the sentence, what's going on in the sentence. That's what we're dealing with, okay? A lot of what the SAT is going to test you on is your knowledge of this. So it's going to be testing, do you know what you actually need to have a complete sentence to express a complete thought or idea? Can you identify different types of sentences and how they're being used in a sentence and why? Those are kinds of things that the SAT writing and language test is going to be asking you. So knowing that, in essence, essentially, a sentence is a complete thought or idea. If you are missing any one of these ingredients, if you're missing a noun or pronoun that's telling you who or what the sentence is about, it's not a complete sentence. Same thing with a verb. If you have just the noun or pronoun that's telling you who or what the sentence is about, but you're missing the action, so missing like what that noun is doing or what's being done to that noun or pronoun, then you do not have a complete sentence. You have what's called a fragment. Okay, so a fragment is a type of it's an incomplete sentence, basically, which all of you should be familiar with these terms from writing and editing, okay, from over the years. Another example of a type of sentence, like a concept that they're going to test you on frequently, is identifying run-on sentences. So run-on sentences are different than fragments because a run-on will always have more than one idea in a sentence that it's conveying, because it is technically more than one sentence that you're trying to express. This is why understanding punctuation and when you use it is also important on this test, because you can identify that, oh, you're talking about topic A here, but then you start on a completely different idea and you forgot punctuation in there to separate those two complete thoughts from one another. You can combine sentences and create a compound sentence where you are basically combining two different complete thoughts together. That's okay. The same thing with compound complex or complex sentences. Okay, and I'll get more into what those technically are, but they're the same thing. But when you start having like 7 ideas in a row, that's like, you know, like idea A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and you have no punctuation whatsoever there, or there is punctuation but it's all commas, and you don't have any place where you're coming to a full stop, so you're coming to an end of your thought, then you have a run on. Okay. All right. Where did I want to go? Okay, so what I wanted to look at, we did kind of go over that. So I do want to look at some concrete examples here. There are tons of grammar references out there for students. So if you're not familiar with grammar, you definitely need to investigate things like that. Okay, so actually what I'm going to start us with, there's even one specifically for the SAT and ACT for grammar that they have available, which I'm going to go over in just a second. But I want to look quickly at some of the grammar concepts here. So this is from McGraw-Hill's Handbook of English Grammar and Usage. Okay, any writer really needs to be able to have an understanding of grammar. And if you don't, you need to get one of these references so that you can have a better idea of how to use language and why. Okay. Basic phrases. You can also use it from a library if you can find it, which most places should have. So we've kind of gone over we've given you kind of like an overview of grammar here with the parts of speech, the basic phrases, sentences and clauses. You also have things like verb forms, verbals. You have writing complete sentences, subject-verb agreement, pronoun problems. All of these types of concepts are things that they can test you on in the ACT or in the SAT here. Okay. So what I kind of want to look at right now are specifically sentences. Okay, so we've kind of gone through a basic definition of what the main categories are in the parts of speech, so in terms of language use. Okay, so here, since we know that sentences are a complete thought or idea, they are the building blocks of writing and of thoughts, of conveying ideas. Okay, basically you have a few main types. Okay, so you have what are called, we kind of just went over a fragment. So here, a pizza with anchovies and pineapple in this example is an example of a fragment. You're not actually giving me a verb here. So with that, you're not telling me a complete thought. You're giving me a partial thought. So you're giving me a fragment. We use this in speech all the time because people can kind of imply what they're meaning, or other people can pick up, oh, you mean that's what you want. Like, we can understand that from context. But in formal writing, you don't get that luxury. That's why we always need to be using precise grammar. Okay. So that's an example here of a fragment. So essentially, a lot of sentences will be kind of classified by purpose. So how they're being, like what their intention is. So those kinds of things are things like, if you're dealing on a paragraph level, dealing with a topic sentence, that's its purpose. It's to introduce your topic. If you're dealing with a transitional sentence, like that is transitioning between ideas, helping you connect your thoughts from one idea to another very smoothly, okay, to create flow. Okay. rather than to have things kind of broken up and choppy between ideas. You also have sentences that in a paragraph too that can be about supporting details and evidence. Or additional sentences that are explanatory in nature, that are explaining your thoughts and ideas, okay? And you have things called concluding sentences, which is concluding, wrapping up, restating kind of what this topic, this paragraph was about, okay? But that, I mean, so all of those types of things are true when we're dealing with writing. But we have other types of sentences too, because sentences are kind of classified by what it is that they do, okay? And typically in like a piece of formal writing, we're dealing mostly with declarative sentences. So declarative sentences, regardless if it's like a topic sentence, if it's a evident, if it's any of those aforementioned sentences that I just said, would typically fall under declarative sentences, okay? Because they're stating something. They're providing statements, okay? They're punctuated with periods. So typically you're not going to see a lot of use of exclamation points or question marks in an essay. You're going to see more things like periods, right? So a declarative sentence, this is a declarative sentence. That's actually a good example of a declarative sentence because it's essentially stating a fact or making a statement about something, okay? They can be positive or negative. They can contain dependent clauses or subordinate clauses, as they're also called. And they're always punctuated with a period, okay? We have another type of sentence that you might encounter in our reading and in our writing test, which are interrogative sentences. So interrogative sentences are used for asking questions. So interrogative sentences must be punctuated with a question mark. So all of you should know what a question mark is and basically know how to identify if something is a question, if it's asking something, okay? Imperative sentences are sentences that are going to be giving you a request or a command. So they can, they basically can have two different types of punctuation. You're usually going to see a period. So just like with the declarative sentence where you're kind of making a statement, like in this example, they have go away. That's a great example because it's giving you a command. You could say, give me more, please. That's a request. So that would be, or may I have more is a question. You can phrase it at your request as a question. So that kind of would change things depending on the type of sentence you're using. You can say, cut it out, like raising your voice, exclaiming something like you would with an exclamatory sentence, okay? But all of these will have kind of an implied you as the subject. So you go away, you cut it out, you stop it. So those are how you can kind of identify imperative sentences, as well as by their punctuation or intended punctuation. Exclamatory sentences. Essentially, they're declarative sentences that are punctuated with exclamation points for emphasis. So it can also indicate that you're raising your voice or that you are emotional about something, that you're emphasizing something in essence, okay? So these are all kind of examples of declarative of exclamatory sentences, but they're always going to be punctuated by an exclamation point, all right? So basically, one of the kind of components, you have what's called an independent clause, which can also be known as a main clause, or a dependent clause, which is also known as a subordinate clause. So a clause essentially follows one of those two different structures. Okay, so it's either going to be an independent, in which case it can stand by itself, that's why it's independent, or it's dependent or subordinate, meaning it requires it requires an independent clause being attached to it so that it can, because it can't stand alone, okay? That means it's something that doesn't like it's missing one of those key ingredients, and it's missing either its subject or its predicate that is, or it's using a specific type of pronoun in the case of subordinate clauses, where you are, the way it's phrased and constructed means that it can't stand by itself. It requires being attached to an independent clause. Okay. All right. Anyone have any questions yet? No? Okay. I'm just going to tell you right now, we're not going to go into it right now, but there are things like adverb clauses, adjective clauses, and noun clauses. Okay. So basically what they mean here, in regard to what a clause is that it's a unit of grammatical organization, that is technically below, it's basically the next rank right below a sentence. So a sentence is the top because it's a complete thought or idea. Okay. Whereas the clause isn't complete. It could be almost, but it's not there yet. Okay. There are also phrases, which is below that, where are, like, you can have a noun phrase, you can have an like adjective phrase, clause, like that's essentially what they're meaning by adverb clauses, adjective clauses, and noun clauses. They're talking about phrasing. Okay. All right. We're not going to go into that today. I'm going to give you some real world examples in our reading. In our practice test. So just bear with me a moment. Actually, why don't we go in practice test 10? Did anyone have specific questions that they wanted to go over from the homework on here? Let's focus on the writing and language test first, and then we can, if there's time, go back to the reading test. No? Okay. All right, so let's kind of look at, we'll just kind of start in section 2. Okay. So essentially, here we're dealing with a conjunction. Does everyone see practice test 10 annotations up here with my annotations on it? Okay. All right. So looking at this, question 1 from practice test 10. First question deals with conjunctions. It also deals with parallel structure, which we haven't gone over yet. So I don't really want you to focus on that. But conjunctions, one of the 8 parts of speech. Okay. You also have, let's see if there's another one that's dealing with, so you have comma usage on number 3, right? You're dealing with also non-essential clauses, which we haven't quite gotten to yet, but non-essential clauses fall under clauses. They're dealing with our rules in terms of dealing with sentences, okay, and how to create sentences, okay, and it has to do with comma usage and punctuation. Question 4 has to do with combining sentences. It also has to do with concision, so being concise, so being as precise as possible and succinct as possible, okay? So these are all kinds of things that we've been sort of talking about today. And being able to identify what they are asking you is going to help you to attack each question, okay? We're not going to worry so much about the ideas types of questions, like the flow, the logic. The flow and logic kind of go hand in hand in terms of being able to understand the ideas in a passage. and be able to convey information smoothly from one idea to another. So that has a lot to kind of do with sentences as well, in terms of how they relate to one another and how they're ordered, um, in a way, and to make sure that they're logical. Okay. For that, we need to understand sentences a bit better. Okay. You also have things like transition words and phrases. So these are words that are going to be helping us. Like at is actually a preposition. Rate is a noun. We're dealing with different type. Example is a noun. For is a preposition. We're dealing like, or it's really a conjunction. But it depends on how it's being used. But there are words here that tie back to our 8 parts of speech. So knowing those 8 parts of speech and in essence what they do is critical to understanding the writing and language test. Okay. The ideas part we can't really focus on until you have a foundation of the grammar. If today's kind of lesson has kind of gone over things that you already know, that's awesome. Let me know. And if we can kind of speed ahead with our grammar study, and I can work with any students who need a little bit more kind of grammar review, we can definitely do that. And we can focus on trying to get to the slightly more harder question sections, which are dealing with understanding the ideas and interpreting and analyzing the material in the text. Okay. As opposed to just focusing on the grammar. Okay. Um, but understanding how we form sentences, how we form ideas and thoughts and how we express them and convey information to other people is critical to our understanding of the writing and language test, because it will affect our ability to analyze and interpret writing in this context. Okay. To be able to understand what the author's intention was and understand it in a way that is grammatically correct, because we're dealing again with those standard English conventions, with those grammar and mechanics rules. Okay, so knowing the basic parts of speech is your stepping stone here, so that we can then focus on more complex ideas related to this section. Okay, which is understanding the ideas themselves. Okay, and understanding what the author is actually doing, what their intended outcome for the reader is, as well as how to improve the language so that it is more easily communicated to other people. Okay, and more effectively communicated to other people so that they can understand our thoughts. Okay. Question 7 here, just to kind of reiterate, is dealing with syntax, the logic of the syntax. Okay, so you're dealing with a main clause, so an independent clause with an introductory phrase, which we'll get to in a future session here. But it essentially, in essence, needs a subject. Okay, that's why question 7, it says, Giselle's story finally hit upon an image that became its basis, a cat watering a battered stovepipe hat. Okay, so that's the full sentence. But the correct answer is C in this particular example, because Giselle finally hit upon the image that became the basis for his story. That's the central idea. Finally hit upon an image that became its basis. So we are missing in this example a clear subject. So it's introducing. It has an introductory phrase. I just started at 7. So that's another kind of thing that you want to be paying attention to, where the sentence actually starts, not just to where the underlined portion is. Because if you don't have the full context, you're going to miss things in this. And this is why underlining is critical too. Okay. And looking at a sentence or an underlined portion in the writing and language test is important to be able to look at it on an individual minute level in terms of just the underlined section and understanding its grammatical function in the sentence, but also at the same time then taking it a step further and looking at it, how it's being used and why it's being used in the sentence as a whole. And sometimes the writing and language section, especially for questions that are dealing more with ideas, are going to, or the connection between ideas, so transitioning between ideas and thoughts, is going to require you to do a little bit more reading above or below the section that they've underlined for you to look at, okay, in isolation. You need to look at it on a minute level, and you need to look on it on a more global level, and always within the context at least of the sentence itself, okay? Some questions will require you to do a little bit more reading around um, that that underlined portion, okay? Um, all right, let me do one quick example here. So here, question 10, dealing with common usage to separate dependent phrase from independent clause. So you have the subordinate phrase, you have the subordinate clause here that needs to be attached to an independent clause. So that's what you're dealing with, and you need to identify in question 10 what um, what you need, because you can't just have a sentence that says in the years that followed. Well, I mean, in the years that followed, that's introducing information. So there should be a comma there instead of a period. Okay, and you can tell that this is a punctuation question because all of the examples are including some form of punctuation. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. So for homework this week, you are going to be doing practice test 9. So that's the reading, evidence-based reading test and the writing and language test. We're going to continue our grammar discussion next week because there's a lot of information to go over. If you don't understand anything we kind of went over today, which was just kind of our introduction, please let me know in an email. And we'll go into more in depth the types of grammar questions you're going to see. But this is kind of our introduction to the writing and language test, which is more complex because it's dealing with our understanding of language, okay, and ideas. All right, so practice test 9, and then for reading, you should also do chapter 8 and 13, I believe, for this week. I'll send out an email and you'll be all set from there, okay? And anyone working on the essay or the vocabulary needs to do the equivalents for this week, okay? All right, thanks everyone. Any questions before I head out? My email will be sent out in the homework email, but it is in the course documents that you've received so far. But I can type it here for you. Thanks everyone. I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye.
Okay, so thanks for watching, and please remember to contact us at info@embracetutoring.com to set up any personalized private tutoring sessions you would like. Stay tuned for future videos, and best of luck with your studies. We definitely encourage you to visit our Instagram as well as TikTok pages if you have any questions along the way. Take care, guys. Best of luck with your studies.